The sun sank behind the barns of White Buffalo Ranch, turning the prairie into a sheet of fire. Dust hung in the air like copper smoke, and the wind carried the sharp bite of alkali and sweat. Imogene Hart staggered through the dust with 3 hay bales lashed across her back by a crude rope harness. Her dress, once a respectable dove-gray calico, hung in tatters around her knees. The rope had eaten through the fabric of her bodice and carved raw trenches into her shoulders where the skin had split and bled. Every step made the world tilt and blur the horizon, wavering like a fever dream. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Gus, with tobacco stains in his beard, rode beside her on a bay gelding. He snapped his short whip over her head, the crack echoing across the empty fields like a gunshot. "Move, girl, Pike wants that stack down before dark." Her boot caught in a wagon rut. The earth lurched sideways. She pitched forward, arms flailing uselessly, and the bales shifted on her back, their combined weight ready to slam her into the dirt and snap her spine like a dry branch. A strong hand grabbed her upper arm. Another arm braced against the sliding hay, taking most of the weight with sudden effort. A Lakota warrior in fringed buckskin stood beside her, his feet planted wide, his body angled to keep the load from crushing her. His long dark hair was bound with a narrow beaded headband, a single eagle feather catching the last red light. Beadwork glinted at his throat and wrists. His eyes dark and steady as river stones took in her rope burns with a single glance. "Let me carry that load." He said, his voice low and measured. The foreman's whip cracked toward them. Dust exploded at their feet, stinging their eyes. Imogene and the warrior locked eyes for a heartbeat, both knowing this simple act could get them whipped or worse. In that instant, she saw no pity in his face, only quiet recognition that something was wrong and a willingness to step into the path of it. Then Gus spurred his horse between them, and the moment shattered like glass under a boot heel. 2 months earlier, Imogene Hart had stepped off the westbound train in Red Bluff with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter of condolence in the other. The letter was from the ladies' committee, informing her that her intended husband, Magnus Hart, had perished in a March blizzard. The train platform was a rough-hewn thing of splintered wood and rusted nails, and the town beyond it looked like something thrown together in haste and never improved upon. False-fronted buildings leaned against each other like drunks. Mud from the spring thaw caked the streets. The smell of horse dung and wet wood smoke hung in the air. She had traveled for 11 days from Boston. She was 23 years old. She had worked in a textile mill since she was 14, operating looms in a building that shook with mechanical thunder, breathing air thick with cotton dust. Her hands were calloused, her lungs were scarred, and her savings, $23.40, were sewn into the lining of her dress. She had answered Magnus Hart's advertisement because she wanted a place where her labor would mean something more than filling another man's pocket. She had imagined a small cabin, a plot of land, a life built by her own hands. Instead, she found a committee of well-dressed women waiting on the platform with black armbands and murmured sympathies. They surrounded her like crows around carrion, their voices low and soothing, their eyes appraising. The leader was a stout woman named Mrs. Caldwell, whose husband owned the general store. She took Imogene's hand and pressed it between her own. "You poor dear," Mrs. Caldwell said. "To come all this way, only to find tragedy. We have been discussing what is to be done with you." The phrase, "what is to be done with you," settled over Imogene like a shroud. Behind the committee stood Orville Pike. He was a tall man with a narrow face and eyes the color of dirty ice. He wore a black frock coat and a string tie, and he held his hat in his hands with an expression of somber concern. When Mrs. Caldwell introduced him, he stepped forward and inclined his head. "Miss Hart," he said. "I knew Magnus. Not well, but enough to respect him. He was a good man, and he deserved better than to die alone in the snow. I am sorry for your loss. His voice was smooth and measured like a preacher's. Imogene searched his face for sincerity and found only a careful mask. Mr. Pike has generously offered to take you in. Mrs. Caldwell continued. He has a large ranch and can provide room and board while we sort out your affairs. It is the most practical solution, given your circumstances. Imogene's circumstances. The phrase was a polite way of saying that she was penniless homeless and utterly without recourse. She looked at the committee at Pike, at the muddy street beyond. She thought about her $23 sewn into her dress, about how far it might take her if she simply turned around and boarded the next train east. But where would she go? Back to the mill, back to the tiny room she had shared with two other girls, where the walls were so thin you could hear every cough and sob. Back to a life where her lungs would give out before she turned 30. I appreciate your kindness, she said carefully. But I should ask what became of Magnus's claim. He wrote to me about a homestead, a spring. Mrs. Caldwell and Pike exchanged a glance. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Imogene saw it. Magnus owed me money, Pike said. Seed tool supplies. He took out credit against his claim. When he died, the debt passed to me. The land office will sort it out eventually, but these things take time. In the meantime, you are welcome to work at my ranch. I pay fair wages, and the work is honest. He was lying. Imogene knew it the way you know the taste of spoiled meat, the way you know the sound of a boot on the stairs when the landlord comes for rent. But she also knew that she had no leverage, no proof, and no one who would believe her, even if she did. I accept your offer, she said. Thank you. Pike smiled. It did not reach his eyes. The first night at White Buffalo Ranch, Imogene slept in a narrow bunkhouse with 3 other women, a cook named Bertha, an older Mexican woman named Luz, who spoke little English, and a young girl named Annie, who could not have been more than 16. The bunkhouse smelled of sweat and wood smoke. The cots were thin, the blankets threadbare. Annie cried quietly in the dark, muffling the sound with her pillow. In the morning, Pike showed Imogene his ledger. The debts were listed in neat, careful columns. Train fare from Boston, $12. Clothing and sundries, $8. Room and board, $2 per week. The total was already staggering, and it would only grow. You will work it off, Pike said. Fair wages minus expenses. Once the debt is cleared, you are free to go. But the wages were barely enough to cover the expenses, and new charges appeared with alarming regularity. A torn dress that needed replacing, a doctor's visit when she twisted her ankle, the cost of soap and lamp oil. The debt grew like a weed, choking out any hope of escape. The work was brutal. She hauled hay from dawn to dusk, her back bent under the weight of bales that left her shoulders bleeding. She dug post holes in soil so hard it felt like stone, her hands blistering and tearing open until they were masses of raw flesh. She scrubbed floors, mended fences, mucked out stalls. At night, she collapsed onto her cot, too exhausted even to remove her boots. Gus, the foreman, watched her with cold eyes and a ready whip. He never struck her directly, but the whip cracked close enough to remind her that he could, that he would if she gave him cause. The other ranch hands were a mix of drifters, criminals, and broken men. Some of them looked at her with pity. Most looked at her with nothing at all, their faces as empty as the prairie sky. But one man watched her differently. Hyamavai moved through the ranch like a shadow. His presence felt more than seen. He was Lakota, one of the few remaining members of a small band that camped upriver near the spring Magnus had once claimed. He worked as a horsebreaker, calming wild mustangs with a patience and skill that bordered on the uncanny. Pike allowed the Lakota to stay because they provided cheap labor and because the land office had not yet finalized the claim. But everyone knew it was temporary. Pike was waiting, biding his time. Hayamovi's uncle Maka was a lean man with deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes that had seen too much. He distrusted Pike with the kind of wariness that comes from watching promises turn to ash. But the band had nowhere else to go. The hunting grounds were gone, taken by settlers and soldiers. The buffalo were nearly extinct. The Lakota who remained had three choices: starvation, reservation life, under the thumb of corrupt agents, or eking out an existence on the margins of white society. Maka had chosen the third, knowing it was only a slower death. Hayamovi was younger, perhaps 30, with a quiet intensity that made him seem older. He moved with economy and purpose, never wasting motion or words. He wore buckskin and moccasins, and his hair was long and braided. He carried a knife at his belt and a rifle slung across his back. He did not smile. Imogene first saw him 3 days after her arrival. She was hauling water from the well, struggling with a pair of heavy buckets that sloshed and spilled with every step. Her arms burned, her legs trembled, and her vision swam with exhaustion. She set the buckets down to rest her breath, coming in ragged gasps. Hayamovi appeared beside her without a sound. He picked up the buckets as if they weighed nothing and carried them to the trough. Then he set them down and walked away without a word. Imogene stared after him, too stunned to speak. The second time she was struggling with a roll of smooth wire, trying to stretch it between two fence posts. The wire was heavy and awkward, and it kept slipping from her grip. Her hands were already torn and bleeding, and every pull sent fresh pain shooting up her arms. She was on the verge of tears when Hayamovi appeared on the other side of the fence. He took the wire from her hands, pulled it taut, and held it in place while she secured it to the post. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once and disappeared into the brush. The third time she was digging a post hole in soil so hard it felt like iron. The sun was directly overhead and the heat was crushing. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, soaking her dress. Her hands were raw, her back screaming. She drove the spade into the ground again and again, making almost no progress. Her vision darkened at the edges, and she swayed on her feet. Hayamovi took the spade from her hands. He dug in silence, his movements efficient and powerful, until the hole was deep enough. Then he handed the spade back to her and walked away. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to ask why he was helping her, but she was afraid of the answer. So she simply watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest, for reasons she could not name. 2 weeks after her arrival, Pike ordered a new fence strung across the narrow bend where the Lakota women and children came to draw water from the river. The fence was a combination of split rails and smooth wire, designed to cut off access without appearing overtly hostile. Imogene was forced to help. She held fence posts while men stretched the wire until it sang with tension. The wind whipped her hair across her face and sweat stung her eyes. When a post shifted unexpectedly, the wire jerked sideways and caught her forearm. The smooth metal bit deep, tearing a long gash from elbow to wrist. Blood welled up instantly, running hot and fast down to her hand and dripping into the dust. She bit back a cry, her sight going dim. Gus cursed and told her to wrap it tighter and get back to work. Hayamovi rode up on a paint horse. He dismounted without a word and walked straight to Pike, who was leaning against a wagon smoking a thin cigar. "This was not the bargain, Orville," Hayamovi said. His voice was level, but there was steel beneath it. "You promised our women could reach the water." "I promised nothing written," Pike answered. He tapped the stock of his rifle against a fence post. "You want water, you pay in horses, or you move on." Hayamovi took a step closer. "You choke the land. You choke us." Pike swung the rifle like a club. The stock caught Hayamovi square in the shoulder, knocking him backward into the fence. He fell into a thicket of wild rose and hawthorn that Pike had deliberately left growing along the fence line. Thorns tore through his buckskin shirt and into his skin, opening shallow but vicious cuts across his back and ribs. He grunted in pain, his hands scrabbling for purchase, which only drove the thorns deeper. Imogene, moving on instinct, stumbled forward to help. She reached for his arm, trying to pull him free, and her wounded forearm brushed the wire fence. The metal caught the edge of the cut and tore it open even wider, fresh blood welling up in a bright red line. She gasped, her knees buckling. "Back to work, both of you," Pike snapped. He flicked ash from his cigar. "Or I'll have Gus teach you what happens when you waste my time." Hayamovi pulled himself out of the thorns, his breathing careful and controlled. He looked at Imogene's arm and then at his own torn shirt, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words, beyond language, beyond culture. They were both bleeding from Pike's fence. They were both trapped in Pike's world. Later, behind the stack of fence posts where Pike could not see Hayamovi, took Imogene's shaking arm and poured cool creek water over the wound. His fingers were sure and careful, the touch of a man who had dressed many wounds. He picked small splinters of wood and bits of dirt from her skin with the tip of his knife, his movements precise and gentle. Then he tore a strip from his own shirt and wrapped her forearm tightly to stop the bleeding. Their faces were close breath, mingling in the space between them. The intimacy was born entirely from necessity and shared pain. "You have done this before," she said quietly, watching his hands work. "My sister. When she was 10, she fell into a tangle of thorns." His voice was low, almost a murmur. "I pulled them out one by one. She lived through that. Where is she now?" "Dead. Sickness 3 winters ago." He tied off the bandage. "The agents at the reservation gave us blankets. The blankets were diseased. She died with blood in her mouth." Imogene's breath caught. "I am sorry." "Sorry does not bring her back." He released her arm gently. "You have family." "A brother in Boston. He thinks I am married and happy." Her throat tightened. "I wrote him a letter 2 weeks ago. Pike said he would post it. I do not think he did." Hayamovi glanced toward the ranch house. "Men like him do not send letters. They burn them." She looked at him directly, then her eyes red-rimmed from dust and exhaustion. "Why do you help me?" "Because no one helped my sister when she needed it most." He stood brushing dust from his leggings. "I will not make that mistake again." A silent accord was born there. 2 people bleeding from the same fence, recognizing in each other the same trapped, desperate will to survive. They did not speak of it again, but it was there between them, as real as the pain in their bodies and the dust in their lungs. Sam had been Pike's man for 3 years. He was 42 years old, gray at the temples, with hands that were scarred and rope-burned from a lifetime of hard work. He had come west after the war, after watching his younger brother die of dysentery in a Confederate prison camp, after coming home to find his farm burned and his family scattered. He had drifted from ranch to ranch, doing whatever work was offered, asking no questions, keeping his head down. Pike had hired him to do the jobs no one else would touch. Burning out squatters, cutting fences at night, running off homesteaders with threats and gunfire. Sam had done it all without complaint, because Pike had promised him a piece of land someday, a small claim he could file and call his own. A place to stop drifting. But 3 years had passed, and the promise had not materialized. Instead, Pike's demands had grown darker and more brutal. And Sam had begun to notice things. He noticed how Pike's promises always came with conditions. He noticed how Pike talked differently when he thought no one was listening. He noticed how Pike looked at the girl Imogene with a kind of possessive hunger that made Sam's skin crawl. 2 years back, Sam had owned a dog, a rangy yellow mutt named Buck that followed him everywhere. The dog was good company, the only living thing Sam could talk to without feeling judged. One afternoon, Buck got into Pike's chicken coop and killed 3 hens. Pike had dragged Sam out to the coop and pointed at the dead chickens with the toe of his boot. "Your dog did this," Pike said. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "You will shoot him, or I will dock your wages until the chickens are paid for. And then I will shoot him myself." Sam had stood there with his pistol in his hand, looking at Buck's trusting eyes. The dog's tail was wagging. The dog had no idea what was happening. Sam raised the gun, his hand shaking, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the ranch yard. The dog dropped instantly, its tail still mid-wag, confusion frozen on its face. Sam had buried Buck behind the barn. He had not spoken of it since, but the memory sat in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy and immovable. He dreamed about it sometimes. In the dreams, Buck was still alive, still wagging his tail, and Sam pulled the trigger again and again. But the dog never died. It just kept looking at him with those trusting eyes. One afternoon, standing outside Pike's office window while pretending to oil a saddle, Sam heard Pike and Gus talking in low voices. "When this blows over," Pike was saying, "we'll need someone to blame. A drifter like Sam fits the bill. No family, no friends. He'll swing and we'll be clear." Gus chuckled. "You think he'll run?" "He won't get the chance," Pike said. "I'll make sure of it." Sam's hands went still on the leather. He felt something cold settle into his gut, something that had been building for 3 years and had finally crystallized into clarity. Pike was going to use him as a scapegoat. Pike was going to let him hang. He thought about Buck. He thought about the look in the dog's eyes just before he pulled the trigger. He thought about all the things he had done for Pike, all the promises that had turned to ash. And he realized that he had spent 3 years being Pike's dog, doing whatever Pike ordered, never once asking why. He was done being a dog. 3 weeks after the fence was built, the bend quickly fouled. Without access to the clean flow, the Lakota women had to walk a mile farther along the river to find water that was not choked with mud and cattle dung. Children staggered under buckets that sloshed and spilled. When a stomach sickness hit the camp cramps, vomiting bloody flux, Maka rode to the ranch and demanded barrels from Pike's deep well, the one fed by an underground spring that never ran dry. Pike laughed in his face. "You want my water, you bring me horses. Otherwise, you drink what the river gives you." Maka rode away in silence, his jaw set. That night, Hayamovi slipped into the hay yard where Imogene was working. The moon was a thin crescent offering little light. He moved without sound, appearing beside her like a ghost. "We borrow 2 barrels," he said quietly. "We roll them to the well, fill them, and bring them to my camp. No one has to know." She hesitated. The ledger was already crushing her. If Pike caught her stealing, he would add the cost of the water to her debt, or worse, he would have her arrested. But she thought about the Lakota children she had seen playing by the river, their faces bright and innocent. She thought about them vomiting in the dust while Pike's cattle drank their fill from the clean well. "Show me," she said. They moved like thieves and like laborers who knew every inch of the ranch. Hayamovi rolled 2 empty barrels from the storage shed, and together they lifted them onto a small handcart. The barrels were heavy even when empty, and maneuvering them in the dark was treacherous. Twice they had to stop and wait, while a ranch hand stumbled past, too drunk or too tired to notice them. The well was behind the main house, surrounded by a low stone wall. Hayamovi lowered the bucket and hauled it up again, the rope creaking in the silence. He poured water into the first barrel, then the second. The sound of the water splashing seemed deafeningly loud. Imogene's heart hammered in her chest. Every shadow looked like a man. Every sound was a footstep. When the barrels were full, they lifted them back onto the cart. The weight was enormous. Imogene's arms screamed in protest, her back threatening to give out. But she gritted her teeth and pushed. Hayamovi pulled from the front, his muscles straining. They were halfway across the yard when a voice cut through the darkness. "Who's there?" It was one of the night guards, a man named Tully. He was walking toward them, rifle in hand, squinting into the shadows. Hayamovi grabbed Imogene's arm and pulled her behind a stack of hay bales. They crouched in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe. Tully came closer, his boots crunching in the dirt. He stopped 10 feet away, so close Imogene could hear him breathing. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle any sound. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Tully stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then he spat into the dirt and walked away, muttering under his breath. They waited until his footsteps faded. Then they moved again, faster now, knowing that time was running out. They reached the edge of the ranch and pushed the cart onto the open prairie. The ground was uneven, and the cart bounced and jolted, threatening to tip over. Imogene's hands were slick with sweat. Her arms burned. Her lungs felt like they were on fire. Halfway to the river, they heard hoofbeats behind them. Riders coming fast. "Drive!" Hayamovi barked. He pushed the cart from behind while Imogene pulled from the front, her feet slipping in the loose dirt. The riders were gaining, their shouts echoing across the empty land. A gunshot cracked through the night. The bullet struck the rim of one barrel, shattering the wood and sending water gushing across the cart. They ran. The cart lurched and bounced. Imogene's lungs screamed for air. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. Behind them, the riders were closing in, their horses snorting and pounding. Another shot. This one hit the ground beside her foot, sending up a spray of dirt. They reached the ford, just as the riders came within range. Hayamovi shoved the cart into the shallow water, and they waded across the current, tugging at their legs. Bullets cracked overhead, splashing into the water around them. But the riders did not cross. They stopped at the edge of the river, shouting curses and threats, but unwilling to follow into the darkness. The remaining barrel reached Maka's camp. Sick children drank that night, their faces flushed with fever, their hands trembling as they held the dipper to their lips. Imogene watched them drink, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, and she felt something shift inside her. She had spent 3 months doing whatever Pike ordered, accepting his lies and his chains, because she had no choice. But tonight she had made a choice. She had stolen from him. She had fought back. It was a small act, but it was hers. Maka was not pleased. When Hayamovi returned the next morning, his uncle stood waiting outside his lodge, arms crossed. "You risk our people for her," Maka said. His voice was low and dangerous. "If Pike learns you stole from him, he will drive us out, or worse." "Children were dying," Hayamovi answered. "Children die every winter. It is the way of things." Maka stepped closer, his face hard. "She is not our responsibility. She chose to come to this place. She chose nothing. He trapped her the same way he traps us. Then she should free herself?" Maka's voice was bitter. "We have enough burdens without carrying hers. You forget who you are, nephew. You forget what matters." "I forget nothing." Hayamovi's voice was quiet but firm. "I remember my sister. I remember how no one helped her when she needed it most. I remember standing over her grave and swearing I would not make that mistake again. This woman is trapped. She needs help. I will give it." Maka studied him for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. Your heart will get us all killed." "Perhaps," Hayamovi said, "but it is still my heart." In town, Mary Klein sat at her small desk in the schoolhouse, composing a telegram to the U.S. Marshal in Omaha. She had spent the past week checking land records at the county office, and what she had found made her blood boil. Magnus Hart's claim on Hart Spring had been filed with a clause naming his intended bride, Imogene Hart, as his heir in the event of his death. The clause had been inserted by Magnus's brother, a lawyer in St. Louis, as a precaution. But the letter notifying the ladies' committee of this clause had never been delivered. Instead, it sat in a file at the land office, buried under other papers. Pike had been in that file. Mary had seen the clerk's notation, "O. Pike inquiring re Hart, claim March 12th. She wrote the telegram carefully, laying out the suspected fraud with precision and restraint. Too much emotion would make her seem hysterical. Too little would make the matter seem trivial. She described Imogene's condition as witnessed by Dr. Ames, malnourished, overworked, bearing signs of physical abuse. She described Pike's attempts to fence off the water source used by the Lakota camp. She requested an investigation into the legitimacy of Pike's claim on Hart Spring. Dr. Ames signed the telegram as a witness, adding his professional credentials to give it weight. Marshal William Cobb received the telegram 3 days later. He read it twice, then called for his deputies. "We ride in 4 days," he said. "Gather every land record related to Hart Spring, and bring enough men to handle trouble if it comes." 4 weeks after the water theft, Pike heard about the telegram from a clerk at the Red Bluff Telegraph Office who owed him money. The clerk rode out to the ranch in the middle of the night and told Pike everything. Pike's face went white, then red. Then he dismissed the clerk with a handful of coins and a warning to keep his mouth shut. Pike called a meeting in his office with Gus Sam and 2 other hands. He spread a rough map of the valley across his desk, his finger stabbing at the spot where Maka's camp sat. "The marshal is coming," Pike said. His voice was flat and cold. "He is coming to investigate the Hart claim, and if he finds anything, I'm finished. So we are going to make sure there is nothing to find. We ride tonight. We burn out the Indians, scatter their horses, and make it look like they started the trouble. When the marshal arrives, he will see savages causing problems, not us. And the girl?" He looked at Sam. "The girl will not be here to testify. She will have run off, or she will have met with an accident. Either way, she will not be a problem." Gus nodded, already reaching for his gun belt. The other 2 hands shifted nervously, but said nothing. Sam's jaw tightened. He thought about Buck. He thought about the dog's confused eyes, the wagging tail, the trust. He thought about himself pulling the trigger because Pike had ordered it. And he thought about the Lakota children playing by the river. And he thought about Imogene staggering under the weight of the hay bales, her shoulders bleeding. "You have a problem, Sam?" Pike asked. His eyes were flat and merciless. Sam thought about the conversation he had overheard weeks ago. Pike was planning to use him as a scapegoat. Pike was planning to let him hang. And in that moment, Sam made his choice. "No problem," Sam said quietly. But his hand moved to the butt of his pistol, and this time it was deliberate. This time it was a promise. Pike smiled. "Good, because if things go wrong, I need someone to take the blame. A drifter with no ties. Someone expendable." He said it casually, as if discussing the weather, and Sam felt the cold certainty settle even deeper into his gut. "I'll get the horses ready," Sam said. He walked out before Pike could see the rage in his eyes. The moment Pike's attention shifted, Hayamovi slipped into the bunkhouse. Pike had taken to chaining Imogene at night, locking an iron cuff around her ankle and securing it to a ring bolted into the floor. The chain was just long enough for her to lie down on her cot, but not long enough to reach the door or the window. Hayamovi knelt beside the cot and pulled out a cold chisel he had stolen from the smithy. He wedged it into the iron link and struck it with a rock wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. The metal rang softly with each blow. On the third strike, the link broke. Imogene woke with a gasp, her eyes wide and disoriented. Hayamovi pressed a finger to his lips. "Finger, Pike is coming," he whispered. "He is coming to burn my camp and to kill you. You cannot walk far, but you can ride. We leave now." She nodded, her breath coming in short, frightened gasps. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they slipped out of the bunkhouse. The ranch was quiet, most of the hands already asleep or too drunk to notice. Hayamovi led her to the corral, where a spare pony stood, a wiry little mare with kind eyes. He lifted Imogene into the saddle as gently as he could, but even that small effort made her cry out. Her ribs were bruised, her body battered from months of brutal labor. He swung onto his own horse, and they took off across the fields at a hard gallop. Every hoofbeat drove pain through Imogene's exhausted body. The wind tore tears from her eyes. Her lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. Twice she nearly fell from the saddle, her vision going dark, and twice Hayamovi reached across and grabbed the back of her dress, hauling her upright without breaking stride. By the time they crested the ridge above the river valley, she could barely see. Smoke rose from burning grass. Pike's riders circled Maka's lodges, shouting, waving torches. Men shoved women and children toward the water rifles, aimed at anyone who hesitated. The world tilted sideways. "Stay with me," Hayamovi barked. His voice cut through the fog in her mind. She clenched her jaw, tasted blood where she had bitten her tongue, and dug her heels into the pony's flanks. Pike saw them on the ridge. He turned to Sam and pointed at the cattle pen. "Turn them loose. Drive them straight through the camp. We will blame the stampede on the Indians." Sam looked at Pike for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and rode toward the pen. Pike smiled, thinking he had won. But Sam was done being Pike's dog. Sam reached the cattle pen and dismounted. The cattle were restless, sensing something wrong. They milled and snorted, their eyes rolling white in the darkness. Sam opened the gate and fired his rifle into the air. The cattle exploded into motion. They thundered down the slope toward the camp, a river of muscle and horn in blind panic. The ground shook. Dust rose in choking clouds. Women screamed and grabbed their children, running for the river. Men tried to turn the herd, but it was like trying to stop an avalanche with bare hands. Imogene's pony spooked hard and stumbled. The world slowed to a crawl. She felt herself leaving the saddle, felt the ground rushing up to meet her. Her body hit the earth with bone-jarring force, the impact driving the air from her lungs in one explosive burst. For a long, terrible moment, she could not breathe, could not move, could only lie on her back, staring at the sky, while her chest screamed for air that would not come. The ground trembled beneath her. She turned her head and saw the stampede coming straight for her. Hundreds of cattle, their eyes rolling white with terror, their hooves churning the earth into a storm of dust and destruction. Time stretched. Each heartbeat felt like an hour. She could see individual animals now. A red steer with a torn ear, a young heifer with wild eyes, a massive bull leading the charge foam flecking its mouth. She could hear the thunder of their hooves, a sound like the end of the world. She tried to roll, tried to move, but her body would not obey. Her lungs were still empty, her chest locked in spasm. Hayamovi threw himself from his horse and ran on foot through the oncoming herd. The world became a blur of motion and sound and terror. He slipped between the massive bodies, his movements born of desperation and a lifetime of knowing how animals move. A steer's shoulder slammed into him, spinning him sideways. He kept his feet by sheer will, using the animal's momentum to push himself forward instead of down. A horn grazed his thigh, tearing through his buckskin leggings and leaving a long, bloody furrow. The pain was white-hot immediate, but he shoved it aside. 5 more steps. 4. 3. A tumbling steer's hoof came down inches from his face, so close he felt the wind of its passage, so close he could smell the dirt on its hide. He ducked, rolled, came up running. 2 steps. 1. He reached Imogene with seconds to spare. He grabbed her under the arms and half-dragged, half threw her into a shallow irrigation furrow that had been carved years ago and then abandoned when the homesteader gave up. The furrow was barely 3 feet deep, muddy and stinking of stagnant water. They hit the wall together, and Hayamovi covered her body with his own, pressing them both flat against the earth as the world exploded above them. Hooves crashed past so close that dirt rained down on their backs. The sound was deafening, a physical force that pressed against their eardrums and then rattled their teeth. The belly of a steer brushed Hayamovi's shoulder blade, the coarse hair scraping his skin. Another hoof came down on the edge of the furrow, collapsing a section of the wall and sending mud cascading over them, filling Imogene's mouth and nose. She choked, gasped, tried to scream, but Hayamovi's hand covered her mouth. "Do not move," he hissed into her ear. "Do not make a sound." One panicked yearling tumbled into the ditch with them, its legs flailing wildly, its hooves churning the mud into a deadly maelstrom. One hoof struck Hayamovi's shoulder, and he felt bone crack. Pain exploded through him, white and blinding. But he planted his boots against the far wall and shoved with everything he had left. His legs burned. His shoulders screamed. But slowly, inch by inch, the yearling's weight shifted, and it scrambled up and out, disappearing into the chaos above. The stampede lasted forever and ended in an instant. One moment the world was thunder and terror, and the next it was silent, except for the distant bellowing of cattle and the crackling of flames. Imogene and Hayamovi lay pressed together in the mud, faces inches apart, hearts pounding in the same wild rhythm. Her fingers were tangled in the torn fringe of his shirt. His arm was locked across her ribs, holding her against the wall. Blood from his torn thigh mixed with the mud beneath them. "I thought I was dead," she whispered. Her voice was shaking, her breath hot against his cheek. "I saw them coming and I could not move. I could not even breathe. I thought, you are not dead." His voice was rough, his breath ragged. "You are here, with me." "I am afraid," she said. The words were torn from somewhere deep inside her, a place she had kept locked since the day she stepped off the train. "I am so afraid all the time. Of Pike. Of dying here. Of never being anything but his. You are not his." Hayamovi's voice was fierce, absolute. "You never were. He does not own you. He cannot." Something broke open inside her, then some dam she had built to hold back the terror and exhaustion and despair. Tears cut clean lines through the mud on her face. "Then why do I feel like he does?" "Because he wants you to. But wanting does not make it true." The last of the cattle passed, but neither of them moved yet. They lay in the mud, breathing together, holding each other not out of romance, but out of pure, desperate need. 2 people who had looked death in the face and survived it by holding on. The fire had spread. The dry grass caught like tinder, and flames raced across the valley floor, driven by the wind. Black smoke rolled in thick waves, choking the air. Lakota women splashed water from the river onto burning teepees, but the flames were too fast, too hungry. A child's cry cut through the smoke, sharp and terrified. Imogene and Hayamovi pulled themselves from the ditch, coughing, their eyes streaming. She could barely stand. Her ribs screamed with every breath. He He steadied her with his good arm, his injured shoulder hanging useless. The heat was enormous, a living wall pressing against them. A burning lodgepole collapsed 5 feet to their left, sending up a shower of sparks that singed their hair and clothes. Imogene's skirt caught fire at the hem. Hayamovi beat it out with his bare hand, the flames searing his palm, blistering the skin. He did not stop until every ember was dead. Through the smoke, they saw Makka carrying 2 children toward the river, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wild. A woman knelt beside a fallen man, trying to drag him away from the flames. Hayamovi left Imogene leaning against a wagon and ran to help his body moving on instinct despite the pain. Gunfire cracked through the chaos. Pike and his men were circling the camp, shooting into the air, driving people toward the flames instead of away. A bullet struck the wagon wheel 2 inches from Imogene's hand, splintering the wood and sending fragments into her face. She ducked, her heart hammering. Another shot. This one hit a water barrel beside Makka, punching a hole through the wood and sending water gushing across the ground. The old warrior stumbled, nearly dropped the children he was carrying, and Hayamovi was there to catch them, to steady his uncle to keep moving. Gus fired a shot that splintered a lodgepole inches from a woman's head. She screamed and fell, covering her child with her body. Imogene, her vision swimming, picked up a broken fence rail and swung it at Gus's horse as he rode past. The rail connected with the animal's shoulder, and the horse reared, throwing Gus into the dirt. His rifle skittered away across the ground, disappearing into the smoke. Imogene grabbed the rifle. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She had never fired a rifle in her life, but she had watched the men on the ranch enough to understand the basics. She pulled back the hammer, the click loud, even over the roar of the fire. Pike turned at the sound. He saw her and laughed, the sound high and mocking. "You do not even know how to hold that, girl." She aimed it at his chest, her arms trembling with exhaustion and rage. "I know how to pull a trigger." Pike's smile faded. His hand moved toward his pistol. But before he could draw, Sam fired from 20 feet away. The shot echoed across the valley. The bullet took Pike in the shoulder, spinning him around. Pike stared at Sam with wide, disbelieving eyes. You made me shoot my dog," Sam said. His voice was flat and cold, empty of everything but truth. 2 years ago. Buck, you told me to kill him or lose my job. I pulled that trigger, and I have been your dog ever since. I have done every dirty thing you asked. I have burned and stolen and lied, and all for a promise you never meant to keep. Well, I am done." Pike's face twisted with rage and disbelief. He lunged for his pistol with his good hand, his fingers closing around the grip. Sam fired again. This shot took Pike in the leg, and he toppled from his horse, hitting the ground hard. He rolled, trying to reach his gun, and Sam walked over and kicked it away. It skittered across the dirt and disappeared into the flames. "You were going to hang this fire on me?" Sam said quietly, standing over Pike. "I heard you tell Gus. You were going to let me swing while you walked free. But I will not let you make me into a murderer of children. Not again. Not ever." Pike clawed at the ground, trying to drag himself away, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. Imogene stepped forward and placed her boot on his wrist, pinning it. The rifle was still in her hands, still aimed at his chest. "You lied," she said. Her voice was shaking with exhaustion and rage, and something deeper, something harder. "You told me Magnus's claim was yours. You told me I had nothing. But you knew. You knew it was mine." Pike spat blood. His face was gray, his breathing labored. "Prove it." "I will." The fire was roaring now, consuming everything in its path. The heat was unbearable. Smoke choked the air. And through the chaos, Imogene saw Pike's office, the small building where he kept his strongbox, his ledgers, his documents. It was already burning flames licking up the walls, smoke pouring from the windows. "Watch him," she said to Sam, thrusting the rifle into his hands. Then she turned to Hayamovi. "I have to go back." "You will die," he said flatly. His face was covered in soot and blood, his eyes red from smoke. "If I do not get those papers, Pike wins. Even in chains, he wins." She looked at him directly. "I need that proof." Hayamovi studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Then we go together." They ran toward the burning building. The heat was like a solid thing pushing against them, trying to force them back. The door was open, hanging on one hinge, flames dancing in the frame. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, so thick it was like breathing tar. Imogene dropped to her hands and knees where the air was slightly clearer. Her eyes streamed. Her lungs burned. She crawled toward Pike's desk, the heat searing her skin. The strongbox sat on top, already glowing red from the heat. Hayamovi smashed the lock with the butt of his knife. Inside were stacks of papers, land office documents, letters. Imogene grabbed them all, stuffing them into her dress, not caring that the hot metal of the strongbox blistered her fingers. A beam collapsed behind them, sending up a shower of sparks and embers. The ceiling groaned, sagging dangerously. Hayamovi grabbed her arm with his good hand and pulled her toward the door. They stumbled out just as the roof caved in flames, shooting up into the night sky like a funeral pyre. Imogene clutched the papers to her chest, coughing so hard she thought her lungs would tear. Her hands were blistered and bleeding. Her dress was singed and smoking. But she had them. The proof, the letters, the claim. Pike was still on the ground, Sam's boot on his chest and the rifle aimed at his head. Gus and the other hands had scattered, disappearing into the smoke and darkness like rats fleeing a sinking ship. And then through the haze and the heat and the chaos, they heard hoofbeats. Marshal Cobb and his 2 deputies rode into the valley, their horses picking their way through the burning grass. They saw the destruction, the wounded people, the armed men, and Orville Pike lying in the dirt with blood pouring from his shoulder and leg. But they also saw Imogene Hart standing in the firelight, her dress torn and filthy, her face streaked with soot and blood, clutching a bundle of papers to her chest like they were the most precious thing in the world. Because they were. The courtroom in Omaha was packed. Word of the case had spread, and people came from miles around to see the trial of Orville Pike. Some came out of curiosity. Some came out of a sense of justice. Some came because they hated Indians and wanted to see Pike acquitted. The air was thick with tension and the smell of unwashed bodies. Imogene sat in the front row, flanked by Dr. Ames and Mary Klein. She wore a dress borrowed from Mary Plain and Severe. Her hands were bandaged from the burns she had sustained rescuing the documents from Pike's burning office. Her face was pale and drawn, but her eyes were steady. Pike sat at the defense table in irons, his shoulder and leg bandaged. His lawyer was a slick man from St. Louis named Harrington, who wore expensive suits and spoke in a smooth, cultured voice. He looked at Imogene with barely concealed contempt. Judge Blackwell was a gray-haired man with a stern face and a reputation for fairness. He called the court to order and listened as the charges were read: fraud, attempted murder, arson, assault with intent to kill. Harrington stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, my client is a respected rancher and businessman. The charges against him are based on the word of a girl who came west expecting to be married and found herself disappointed. She is clearly bitter and looking for someone to blame. As for the Indians," he waved a dismissive hand, "they were squatting on land that did not belong to them. Mr. Pike had every right to remove them." Mary Klein stood. She was not a lawyer, but Judge Blackwell had allowed her to present evidence as a concerned citizen and witness. She laid out the land records on the table before the judge. Magnus Hart filed a homestead claim on the tract known as Hart Spring in January of this year, she said. Her voice was clear and precise. The claim included a clause filed by his brother, a lawyer in St. Louis, naming his intended bride, Miss Imogene Hart, as his heir in the event of his death. This letter, she held up a document, was sent by the Ladies' Committee to Magnus Hart, informing him of this clause. It was dated 2 weeks before his death. Magnus never received it. Instead, it was intercepted by Orville Pike. Harrington scoffed. "This is speculation. There is no proof that my client intercepted anything." Mary held up another document. "This is a notation from the Land Office clerk dated March 12th. It reads, 'O. Pike inquiring re-Hart claim.'" Mr. Pike visited the Land Office and examined Magnus Hart's file. He knew about the clause naming Miss Hart as heir, and he deliberately concealed it from her. Judge Blackwell examined the documents carefully. He looked at Pike, who sat stone-faced and silent. Dr. Ames was called to testify. He described Imogene's condition when he first examined her: malnourished, overworked, bearing multiple injuries, consistent with physical abuse. He described the rope burns on her shoulders, the infected blisters on her hands, the persistent cough that suggested early-stage lung damage. "In my professional opinion," Ames said, "Miss Hart was being worked to death. If she had continued under Mr. Pike's employment for another 6 months, she would not have survived." Harrington cross-examined him. "Dr. Ames, is it not true that manual labor is difficult and often results in injuries? Is it not possible that Miss Hart simply found the work too hard and is now looking for compensation?" "It is possible," Ames said. "But it is not true. I have treated ranch hands for 30 years. I know the difference between honest work and abuse. Miss Hart was being abused." Maka was called to testify. He spoke through an interpreter, describing how Pike had promised his band access to the spring and then fenced it off. He described the sickness that swept through the camp, the children who died because they had no clean water. He described the night Pike and his men came with torches and guns. Harrington sneered. "You are squatters. You have no legal claim to the land. Mr. Pike had every right to remove you." Maka looked at him with eyes like flint. "We were there before your fences. We will be there after they rust and fall. The land does not belong to you. You belong to the land." The courtroom murmured, some in approval, some in anger. Sam was called to testify. He described his 3 years working for Pike, the dirty jobs he had done, the promises that had never materialized. He described overhearing Pike's plan to use him as a scapegoat, to let him hang for the arson. He described the moment he decided to turn on Pike. "Why did you do it?" the judge asked. The judge. "Why did you turn on your employer?" Sam was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Because he made me shoot my dog." The courtroom was silent. 2 years ago. Sam continued, his voice flat and empty. "I had a dog named Buck. He was the only thing in this world that gave a damn about me. One day he got into Pike's chickens and killed 3 of them. Pike told me to shoot the dog or lose my job. So I shot him. And I have been thinking about that every day since. Thinking about the look in his eyes. Thinking about how he trusted me right up until the moment I pulled the trigger. And when Pike told me to burn out a camp full of women and children, I thought about Buck. And I decided I was done." Harrington stood. "Your Honor, this man is a confessed arsonist and accomplice to attempted murder. His testimony is worthless." Judge Blackwell looked at Sam. "You are aware that you face prison time for your actions?" "Yes, sir," Sam said. "And I will serve it, but I will not carry Pike's crimes on my back." Finally, Imogene was called to testify. She stood and walked to the witness stand, her back straight, her hands folded. Harrington looked at her with contempt. "Miss Hart, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. You came west expecting to marry a man you had never met. When you arrived, you found that he was dead. You were disappointed. You were angry. And now you are trying to steal his land by claiming you were his heir. Is that not the truth? No, Imogene said. Her voice was steady. That is not the truth. She held up the bundle of documents she had rescued from the fire. This is the truth. This letter is from the Ladies' Committee informing Magnus Hart that I was named as his heir. This document is Magnus's homestead claim filed with the land office, clearly stating that his bride, Miss Imogene Hart of Boston, would inherit his improvements in the event of his death. This is the forged release that Mr. Pike tried to force me to sign, claiming that I had no stake in the claim. And this, she held up a ledger, is Mr. Pike's ledger showing the false debts he invented to trap me in servitude. Harrington snatched the ledger from her hands. He flipped through it, his face going pale. Judge Blackwell held out his hand. Let me see that. Harrington handed it over reluctantly. The judge examined it carefully, his expression darkening with each page. Miss Hart? The judge said, How did you obtain these documents? I went back into Mr. Pike's burning office and took them from his strongbox, she said. Because I knew that without proof, no one would believe me. Because I knew that men like Mr. Pike always win unless someone is willing to fight back. The courtroom erupted in noise. Some people cheered, others shouted in anger. Judge Blackwell banged his gavel until silence was restored. He looked at Pike, who sat in irons, his face gray and defeated. Then he looked at Imogene, who stood straight and unflinching. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, Judge Blackwell said, Magnus Hart's improvements on the tract known as Hart Spring passed to his legal heir, Miss Imogene Hart. The evidence is clear and irrefutable. Orville Pike knowingly concealed this information in order to defraud Miss Hart of her rightful inheritance. He then subjected her to forced labor under false pretenses, which constitutes enslavement under the law of this state. He turned to Pike. Orville Pike, you are found guilty of fraud, attempted murder, arson, and assault with intent to kill. You are sentenced to 15 years hard labor at the state prison in Lincoln. May you use that time to reflect on the lives you have destroyed. Pike's face went white, then red. He lunged to his feet shouting, but the deputies forced him back down and dragged him from the courtroom. Judge Blackwell looked at Sam. Samuel Garrett, you are found guilty of arson and complicity in assault. However, given your cooperation and the fact that you ultimately prevented greater harm, you are sentenced to 18 months with the possibility of early release for good behavior. Sam nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Finally, the judge looked at Imogene. Miss Hart, the land is yours. But I will speak plainly. A woman alone on the frontier faces hardship and prejudice. The law can protect your property, but it cannot protect you from the opinions and actions of your neighbors. I suggest you keep your business affairs in writing and your contracts public. And I suggest you hire trustworthy help. It was as close as he would come to acknowledging the reality that her partnership with Hayamovi would be judged harshly by some, and that only careful legal documentation would keep them safe. Imogene understood. I will, Your Honor. Thank you. Outside the courtroom, a crowd had gathered. Some cheered for Imogene. Others muttered darkly about Indians and troublemakers. Hayamovi stood at the edge of the crowd, waiting. When Imogene emerged, their eyes met across the distance, and something unspoken passed between them. They walked away together, side by side, and no one dared to stop them. In the final days of October, as the cottonwoods along the Snake Bend turned gold and the air carried the first bite of winter, Imogene and Hayamovi walked the low hill above Hart Spring at sunrise. The spring bubbled up clear and cold from a cleft in the rock, feeding a small pool that never froze even in the hardest winter. They carried split rail posts, building a fence meant only to keep cattle from trampling the spring. The new carrying yoke rested across both their shoulders, a fence post hung from each end. When the ground dipped, Hayamovi took more of the weight. When he stumbled, Imogene leaned back to steady the balance. They argued about how many acres to plant in hay versus leaving native grass for the horses. Their voices were quiet, their movements unconsciously synchronized. "You will plant too much," Hayamovi said. "The soil here is thin." "Then we plant what it can give and buy the rest," she answered. "We have money now. Money runs out. Grass does not." She smiled. "Then we compromise, half and half." "You are stubborn." "So are you." They worked in silence for a while, driving posts, laying rails. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs. Imogene's cough had faded, though it still returned on cold mornings. Her hands had grown strong again. Maka's band camped near the spring that winter. The children played in the shallows, and the women drew water without fear. Dr. Ames rode out once a month. Mary Klein visited in the spring with a box of books. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Imogene and Hayamovi sat by the fire in the small cabin that had once been Magnus's. She mended a shirt. He carved a new handle for a broken hoe. "Maka says the band will move north in the spring," he said after a long silence. "Will you go with them?" He set down the carving and looked at her. "Do you want me to stay?" She met his gaze. "I cannot run this place alone, and I trust you." It was not a declaration of love, but it was something deeper, a recognition of partnership built on survival and shared labor, and the knowledge that they had both chosen, again and again, not to let the other fall. "Then I stay," he said simply. Outside, the snow fell soft and silent, covering the burned places, filling the wagon ruts, smoothing the land into something new. By summer, Heart Spring Ranch had become a place where Lakota and settlers alike could stop for water and rest. Imogene hired 2 more handsmen who had been run off other ranches for standing up to men like Pike. She paid them fair wages. In the evenings when the work was done, Imogene began teaching the Lakota children to read. She used the books Mary had brought, simple primers with pictures. The children came shyly at first, unsure of this white woman who spoke their language badly, but who never raised her voice. Slowly, they began to trust her. Hayamovi watched from the doorway one evening as Imogene sat with 5 children around her, their faces intent. One little girl, barely 6, traced the letters with her finger and whispered them back. "Why do you do this?" he asked later. "Because no one taught me to read until I was 12, she answered. "And because knowledge is the one thing no one can take from you, not with whips or chains or lies." He nodded slowly, understanding. On a warm August evening, as the sun set over the prairie, Imogene stood on the hill above the spring and looked out over the land that was hers. Hayamovi stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "We did it," she said quietly. "You did it," he answered. "I only helped carry the load." She turned to him. "No, we did it. Together." And in that moment, on that hill with the land stretching out before them, when they understood that they had built something worth keeping, not just a ranch, but a life shaped by their own hands, free from chains and cruelty and the weight of other men's greed. They walked back down the hill as the stars began to appear, their shadows moving as one across the land they had fought for, bled for and claimed as their own. Behind them, the lights of the cabin glowed warm in the gathering dark, a beacon of safety in a world that had tried again and again to break them. But they had not broken. They had bent, adapted, survived. And in surviving, they had built something new, something that would last long after the last fence post rotted and the last ember of Pike's empire turned to ash.